Hello, everyone. My name is Calleigh Kearns, and I am a senior psychology major at Mount St. Mary's University. I have conducted my senior research project on the effect of gender on the perception of sexual harassment scenarios. I looked into the genders of the participant, perpetrator, and victim and how they impact the way that a potentially harassing behavior is perceived. The first item that I would like to discuss is why it is important to research sexual harassment. Unfortunately, sexual harassment is a commonality in society today. In 2019, 33% of college students reported experiencing sexual harassment. This topic has become so prominent in society that it is addressed in academic environments, the workplace, and in mainstream media through the Me Too movement. Placing a focus on the gender differences is imperative because it is an aspect that influences perception. For example, there are stigmas surrounding sexual harassment that change depending on the gender of the person involved. This discrepancy is so widely known that it plays a role in the judicial system. During sexual harassment cases, the judge and jurors are told to use the reasonable woman standard. This asks the parties involved to put themselves into the shoes of a reasonable woman and consider that viewpoint when making their decision. Additionally, the surge of victim stories online through the Me Too movement has forced the gender disparity into the spotlight. Sexual harassment is often seen as a woman's issue. While it is true that women are disproportionately affected, they are not the only people that are victimized. 1/5 of sexual harassment charges are filed by men. However, it can be assumed that the number of men who are victimized is much higher, but often they do not report because historically, male sexual harassment victims were disregarded or often never discussed at all. While women victims are seen as strong for surviving, men are often perceived as weak for allowing themselves to be victimized in the first place. Another issue, aside from gender, that can implicate the perception of sexual harassment is the lack of clarity regarding what constitutes a behavior to be classified as sexual harassment. This gray area contributes to the lack of understanding of inappropriate behaviors. In fact, the majority of adolescent girls and women who have been victimized do not even realize that they experience sexual harassment. It is an all-encompassing term, so it's important to look through different lenses when attempting to define sexual harassment. For this study, the judicial use of the reasonable woman standard, the nationwide employment policies on sexual harassment, and how it is viewed in the media were all considered when forming the operational definition. So, for this study, sexual harassment is defined as any unwelcome, deliberate, or repeated sexual act that is considered to be harassing. Before conducting my own research, I looked to prior studies on sexual harassment for reference. The first article that I read explained a study conducted by Bursick in 1992. The research question of this article pondered the idea of the influence of gender, gender role, and power of the harasser on perceptions of sexual harassment in academic settings. Bursick presented her participants with 5 vignettes of varying severity and had them respond to Likert scale questions for each one. Her results found that overall perception did not vary by gender. However, the major influence on perception was shown in the unequal power aspect. 20 years later, Bursick replicated this study and obtained similar results. The methods of my research were mostly inspired by Bursick's study, but there were other articles that I read on the topic of gender and sexual harassment as well. In 1993, Marks and Nelson also explored gender and power differences in sexual harassment. Unlike Bursick, though, their results did show a significant main effect of gender. They concluded that women rated sexual harassing behavior as inappropriate more than their male participants. More recently, Bitton and Shaw studied participant gender and equal power scenarios in 2013. They found a significant difference in participant gender and perception of sexual harassment. They also found that women perceived situations as sexual harassment more than men and generally were less tolerant. After reading numerous articles and studying the topic closely, I composed 3 different hypotheses that were tested in this experiment. The first hypothesis stated that women would perceive all scenarios of sexual harassment as less appropriate than men. Next, I predicted that men would perceive scenarios with female perpetrators as more appropriate than scenarios with a male perpetrator. And finally, I foresaw that homosexual harassment would be perceived as sexual harassment less than heterosexual interactions. To test my hypothesis, I distributed a survey through the university email platform. I had 166 participants respond, and out of that 166, 120 were female and 46 were male. They all ranged from 18 to 22 years old, as each participant was a student at a small liberal arts university in Maryland, and some were even offered extra credit from their professors for their participation. The participants had to have access to a laptop or smartphone with internet to complete the survey. The survey consisted of 5 vignettes, each with 5 Likert scale questions to follow. First 6 vignettes and questions were used and reworked for this study. There were 4 different conditions. They all featured the same scenarios but with varying genders. Condition 1 highlighted male perpetrators and female victims. Condition 2 featured a female perpetrator and male victim. Condition 3 featured homosexual male interactions, and Condition 4 featured homosexual female interactions. Once the participants began the survey, they were presented their informed consent. They were then instructed to complete the demographic questions and answer a question that sorted them into one of the 4 conditions. Once they were sorted, they were presented with the vignettes and their questions. Upon completion, they then were given a debrief form in which they were informed of the true nature of the study. When interpreting the results, it's important to note the scales in which the data was reported. All of the survey responses were recorded on a 7-point Likert scale. The appropriateness levels were gauged from most appropriate at number 1 to least appropriate at number 7, meaning that the higher the reported number indicates the more inappropriate the behavior. To analyze the data of this study, 2 two-way ANOVA statistic tests were run. The first test was conducted to see if there were differences between gender and level of appropriateness. This test revealed a significant main effect of gender, which can be shown on the graph. The results showed that women perceived all conditions as more inappropriate than males. There was not a significant effect reported between gender and condition for appropriateness. In contrast to the scaling of the appropriateness question, the harassment question was posed as an agree or disagree statement. With 7 options, the question was framed as, "This interaction is an example of sexual harassment." The participants were then asked to rate their level of agreement, from strongly agree at number 1 to strongly disagree at number 7. So for this data set, the lower the reported number, the likelier the behavior to be perceived as sexual harassment. This two-way ANOVA test found 2 significant main effects. First, it was revealed that females perceived behaviors as sexual harassment significantly more than males, as shown in the graph here. A significant difference in which behaviors were perceived as sexual harassment was found as well. A Tukey post hoc analysis was run and concluded that scenarios with a male perpetrator and female victim were deemed as sexual harassment more by both men and women than situations with a female perpetrator and male victim. This finding is also shown in the graph on the slide. This study found interesting and statistically significant results. From these, it can be concluded that there are in fact gender differences in perception of sexual harassment scenarios. I was able to completely support my first hypothesis and partially support my second, but unfortunately did not have any significant findings regarding my third hypothesis. I also noticed that my findings do coincide with those of prior research and can be used in support. I was very intrigued to see that females reported scenarios with male perpetrators and female victims as harassment more than if the roles were reversed. I was surprised by this because I believe that women would perceive the situations equally. Future research can take that finding and find more data to explain it. Although producing significant results, my study had a major limitation of a very small effect size. The data was measured in the means of the answers reported, which caused the majority of the numbers to be very close together. Perhaps reporting the sums of the presenting questions to produce a yes or no answer could have combated this. So due to the small effect size, my study's findings were statistically significant but did not reflect any practical significance. So, I conducted my research and analyzed my data. Where can we go from here? There are a bunch of different ways that the topic of gender and sexual harassment can be studied. Taking inspiration from this study, researchers could focus on just homosexual interactions. Now this would be interesting to see because it would gather more data and could place a greater focus on those interactions and perhaps result in finding significance. Also, it would be very interesting to study different age groups and their perception on the topic of sexual harassment. Perhaps researchers could study just one other age group or group the participants by age and compare their answers in one large study. Overall, this topic can be studied and expanded upon in various ways and in various disciplines. It was extremely interesting to research, and I would recommend it to everybody. And here are my references. And please, if you have any questions or comments, reach out and let me know. Thank you for your attention and have a great break.